In our previous video, we embarked on an exploration of Jean-Paul Sartre's concept of temporality with a particular emphasis on the past. Our analysis revealed that the past, characterized by facticity, contingency, and the in itself, also embodies a dynamic relation between the for itself and the in itself in the modes of having been and becoming. In this sense, the past is always something I experience in the present as both me and not me, a past me who I was, and some way still identify with being, though in the mode of not being it. In this video, we advance our examination of temporality by considering its remaining modalities, the present and the future. We'll then engage with the ontology of temporality, analyzing its characteristics as both static and dynamic. Concluding our exploration, we will consider the differences between original and psychic temporality and their connection to the concepts of pure and impure reflection. Some final remarks will be made in which I'll draw parallels to similar notions that I have found in the works of Jacques Lacan. In examining the concept of the present, we confront an intriguing paradox. While the past no longer is, and the future has yet to materialize, the present is the only thing that truly exists or subsists in the here and now. But further reflection unveils a peculiar aspect of this present. When I delineate the present from past and future, what I find is that the present diminishes to an infinitesimal moment that we really can't measure and is ostensibly void of any kind of substance, because that moment, like Zeno's paradox, can always be further divided. As such, Sartre proposes a different understanding of the present, not as a mere temporal moment, but as the manifestation of presence, characterized by a relational dynamic. This presence signifies the for itself's engagement with the in itself. For example, my present right now is designated by my relationship to this camera. This is not first and foremost a relation of physical proximity, but refers to a deeper existential connection. I'm in a kind of ontological relationship of synthesis by which I am present to the camera in the mode of not being that camera. Presence, however, is not merely a connection to an isolated being in itself, such as this camera. It establishes a relationship with the entirety of the in itself, through which the for itself integrates all these beings into a coherent world marked by a co-presence. My interaction with the camera is but a specific manifestation of a broader engagement with that world. For this reason, we can say that the for itself is the being through which the present is brought into the world, endowing beings with a co-presence. In physics, we learn that the light from the sun takes about 8 minutes to reach the earth and be perceived by us. The lamp that I am currently looking at, that's lighting my face, is being produced rather instantaneously, just a few milliseconds from the point of its production and its perception. Now I can see the sun and the lamp's light at the same time. And yet, those lights are being produced at fairly different moments. Nonetheless, despite that temporal difference, all that information is being processed as if it were happening right now. The light created milliseconds ago from the lamp and the light created by our own sun 8 minutes ago, and even the light created millions of years ago by a distant star, all appear to arrive simultaneously. It is us who bring all these lights together into the seamless totality of the present. And I think of this analogously as something what Sartre means by the for itself introducing presence into the world, and therefore, in a sense, giving rise to the world itself. Now, the only way my present relation to this camera makes any sense is that my relation to it is directed toward a future wherein I am planning to use it for a video that I will upload onto YouTube. Presence then is not merely understood as a flight from the past, from being, but it also is a flight toward what one lacks. that is toward potential being, which is the future. So long as the for itself exists, it always exists as what it is not, and thus can never complete itself, never fully coincide with its future possible self. This impossibility is the necessary condition for there being a future. Sartre writes, only a being which is its own revealed to itself, that is, whose being is in question to itself, can have a future. And so the future is an inherent aspect of the for itself. It's not some mental representation of a modified present through psychological understanding, such as through anticipation or imagination. It rather constitutes part of the existential structure that is the for itself. And the for itself is always in a state of becoming, intrinsically oriented toward its future. Yet this is not a one-way street. The future, as a manifestation of the for itself, is shaped by the self's present. To say, I will post this video is to say this present for itself will, as a future for itself, post this video. The future is meaningful only insofar as I am present to it here and now in the mode of another who I will become. Unlike the past, which according to Sartre is a fixed aspect of one's being, the future is fluid and shaped by freedom and possibility. It outlines the limits with which the self can evolve, yet those limits are not predetermined. It is something one is perpetually becoming, influenced by the present self's actions and choices, underscored by the constant possibility of never achieving it. As soon as I accomplish something, it then is no longer present but past. And this sort of never becoming what one is directed toward as a future is part of what leads to an ontological disillusionment, since the present self never quite matches the future self it aspires to be. We are never at one with ourselves, but always incomplete. The thing hoped for is never quite the same as the thing that happens, if only for the fact that one is in the mode of the future and the other in the mode of the past. This dynamic creates a sense of existential angst, as the self is always in a state of being problematically separate from its future, and this is due to its inherent nothingness and freedom. Relations among the three modes of past, present, and future can be thought of in various ways. One way is in terms of static temporality, wherein there is this immutable sequence of before and afters characterized by a unidirectional flow, enabling us to experience events in a kind of sequential one-way manner. This approach casts time as a divider, creating an unbridgeable gap between who I am, who I was, and who I will be. It's this aspect of time that underlies the adage, time heals all wounds, since the past is simply the past that I progressively distance myself from in a sequential unidirectional flow of time. However, this conception of temporality as static raises a difficulty, one reminiscent of Hume's empirical skepticism. If our observations are limited to discrete moments, lacking any kind of intertemporal cohesion, how do we account for time's apparent continuity, where moments seamlessly transition into one another? Now, Hume attributed this seeming unity to habit, arguing that an impression is self-contained, rendering any link to preceding and subsequent events not something ingrained in reality itself, but a product of the mind's tendency to habitually link things together without any inherent causal relationship. Sartre, on the other hand, posits that the separation of before from after paradoxically unites them in a relational framework. To assert that B follows A presupposes an inherent element in A that anticipates B. And so then Sartre asks, who or what is responsible for this relation and unity? Some attempts to establish the unity of time have been presented by the atemporal God of creation for Descartes, or the synthetic unity of an atemporal cogito for Kant. Sartre critiques these approaches, arguing that temporality cannot stem from the non-temporal. Instead, he suggests that temporality is a fundamental aspect of a being that is itself defined by temporality. Temporality, in Sartre's view, is not a standalone concept, but an intrinsic characteristic of the for itself, manifesting itself in an ecstatic relationship toward its future and past. Being ecstatic here implies a kind of distancing from oneself, annihilation that creates a unity which simultaneously divides and multiplies as the for itself engages with various aspects of its being, encompassing both its actuality and potentialities. And he likens this unity that multiplies to the diaspora, defined as the dispersion or spread of a people with a shared cultural and regional origin. The diasporatic for itself, through its nothingness, introduces a quasi-multiplicity into the heart of being, which itself is the foundation for all worldly multiplicities, multiplicities that do presuppose an original unity. Sartre then goes on to discuss three dimensions of this self-distancing or ecstasis that the for itself engages in, and all these will be familiar. One of them is to not be what it is. So with regard to the past, the for itself exists by negating its past, which is its being and facticity in the mode of the in itself. The for itself, as the foundation of its nothingness, is irremediably and gratuitously separated from its original contingency, unable to merge with, but also unable to discard it as it continues to haunt the for itself. And there's an interesting part here where Sartre talks about how the past is brought forth by the for itself through birth. And that birth is a fundamental aspect of the for itself, an a priori embodiment of pastness. He writes, birth is the upsurge of the absolute relation of pastness as the ecstatic being of the for itself in the in itself. Through birth, a past appears in the world. And I find this emphasis on birth particularly interesting in light of Heidegger's emphasis on death. The second dimension is to be what it is not. And this is in relation to the future. So while negating what it is as past, the for itself perceives itself as a lack, constantly striving to become what is not yet. The third and final dimension is to be what it is not and to not be what it is. So this integrates the first two dimensions, and this integration of the two only takes place in the present. So the for itself can only embody these two dimensions of self-distancing in the present, which amounts to this third dimension. Now it's notable, especially again in light of Heidegger, who places precedence on the future. Sartre is much more emphasizing the present among all the temporal modes of past, present, and future. Although the present doesn't hold any ontological precedence or supremacy, he accentuates the present as the domain where the for itself realizes itself and experiences its being as an ongoing process of becoming, shaped by its past and future. We next move on to dynamic temporality, diving into the complexities of duration and the temporal emergence of the for itself, and Sartre questions the nature of the for itself's transition into the past, along with the inception of a new for itself in the present. He challenges traditional philosophical notions, such as those espoused by Kant and Leibniz, which portray humans as static entities. These views imply that change necessitates an underlying constancy, thereby reducing temporality to a mere metric of change and suggesting that without change, there really is no time. Sartre posits in contrast that the notion of a persisting element, independent of change, only holds relevance when in relation to an observer that encompasses both change and permanence as inseparable features of an underlying unity. This unity is fundamentally ecstatic, pertaining to the for itself, but such a unity itself is not a mark of permanence, of essence, but rather it permanently renders change absolute. As such, the for itself contains temporality as one of its inherent structures, binding all things to its present as it ecstatically reaches beyond it. And we must once again continually see how Sartre is attempting a kind of dialectical synthesis in his analysis of traditional dualities. And he's showing how the philosophical problems that have emerged from these dualities is the result of failing to recognize this more fundamental synthesis, which in Sartre's case is housed in and as the self. In our final topic on temporality, Sartre investigates the relationship between original temporality and psychic temporality, particularly regarding how one encounters themselves in the process of enduring. To understand this relationship, it's crucial to inquire into the nature of reflective consciousness, highlighting a fundamental philosophical challenge, that being the unity and relationship between reflective consciousness and the consciousness reflected upon. Reflective consciousness, Sartre asserts, cannot be wholly independent from that consciousness it reflects upon. They are intrinsically linked, though not identical, which itself would void the very act of reflecting. They must instead simultaneously be and not be the same thing. Here it's important to keep in mind the divide between subject as reflecting and object as reflected on. He is, once again, attempting to steer a path away from any kind of idealism or empiricist realism by maintaining the intimate bond between them in yet another synthesis. Now, this act of reflection is not fully equivalent with the for itself, but instead represents a mode of it in the act of annihilating itself. Let's recall that the for itself emerges in the annihilation of the in itself. For the for itself to annihilate itself would mark an attempt to reclaim its being through reflection, whereas the first annihilation entails the loss of being. As such, this reflective process represents a secondary effort of the for itself to comprehend and define its own existence, striving to unify its dual aspects into a cohesive whole that grasps both its being and non-being. And this gives rise to two types of reflection that Sartre identifies, pure and impure. Pure reflection represents an ideal wherein the reflective for itself is fully present to itself as reflected upon, without any objectification. In pure reflection, the reflecting and the reflected on are unified, but exist in a state of not being itself. And to properly appreciate what is being said here, we have to understand that this is a rarefied form of reflection, one that is not immediately apparent to our everyday consciousness. As such, it gives rise to a unique form of knowledge, one that affirms the consciousness it reflects upon while negating its complete otherness, providing an immediate and total intuition of the reflected on, which diverges from typical frameworks of conventional knowing, wherein the source of knowledge is located outside of the subject within objects. We have to contrast this with the more immediate and common ways we reflect upon ourselves in the mode of an impure reflection. But before we do, it's important to make note of the connection between pure reflection and original temporality. If original temporality has to do with the foundational existential structures of the for itself, then this kind of pure reflection would entail a comprehensive view of oneself in all three temporal dimensions, past, present, and future. It would elucidate the self's historicity by understanding the past and present as part of a continuous flow, distinct yet interconnected within the individual's experience. Impure reflection aims to apprehend the reflected on not as a for itself, but as an in itself, wherein the for itself annihilates itself as a for itself through a process of objectification, and then attempts to recover oneself through an interiorization of the object of oneself that is thematized. And Sartre says that this is only done in bad faith, since the for itself presupposes that the in itself is first negating itself to even be a for itself in the first place. So to claim that I am that object is coming in the aftermath of having already declared that I am not that object. So I have to lie to myself, in a sense, about my previous negation of the in itself, hide that from myself so that I can somehow inauthentically claim that that object is me. It's this thematization and reification that gives rise to what Sartre calls here psychic temporality. So what is the psyche here? The psyche entails when the self becomes other to itself in the mode of an object. And as such, we find ourselves firmly within the field of psychology and probably also psychoanalysis. Sartre introduces the ego here as a transcendent unity of the psyche that encompasses the active and passive aspects of personality, including states, qualities, and acts. Now, Sartre identifies a kind of contradiction here in the psyche. that it is both perceiving itself as a cohesive organism like unity, but also as a succession of discrete nows tending toward isolation. So psychic temporality seems to entail a kind of static temporality as well, in which moments are looked at objectively as separate instances that are all equidistant from each other, having little bearing on each other. And yet at the same time, in perceiving ourselves as an object, we imagine ourselves to be this unity. But it's a unity that is actually derived from a piece of the multiple. Out of the multiplicity of individual instances, we sort of select an aspect of that and say that's who we are. And this is in fact a failed synthesis wherein an aspect of the multiple is treated as though it were a unity through objectification and internalization that wrongly seeks to achieve a complete harmonization between the for itself and the in itself. Though this was a very dense section, probably the most dense that I've encountered so far in Being in Nothingness, there's a lot of interesting intersections with various thinkers. I thought a lot about Levinas here, especially when we consider Sartre's notion of otherness and how the true self, in a sense, experiences no otherness within itself. This also sort of connects with Paul Ricoeur's notion of oneself as another. So Sartre does have a sense of otherness that he will get into very soon. And it is an integral part of a full analysis of the self. But you can see perhaps where maybe Levinas especially is going to try to push back against what Sartre is proposing here by prioritizing otherness, not as an objectification, which Levinas considers to be a form of sameness and totality, but as a kind of alterity and unknowability, much akin to the way Sartre is thinking about the openness of the self presented here in its ecstatic dimensions. Another thinker that I'm keeping in mind for obvious reasons is Jacques Lacan, who very much is in conversation with Sartre and his ideas, and you can see not only the influence, but also the ways in which Lacan might be departing from Sartre while also relying on him. Lacan's notion of the ego bears a lot of resemblances to Sartre's. For Lacan, the ego is a kind of virtual object, much like we see in Sartre's notion, and it emerges out of the imaginary mirror stage. So reflection is involved here, wherein there is an identification with an object that constitutes a sense of anticipated wholeness, but it's always a misrecognition, much like how the for itself aspires to be one with itself and becoming the in itself, or at least a piece of it. And even the contradictory nature of the psyche as one that is both fragmented multiplicity and projected unity resonates closely with Lacan's ego, that though marking an achievement of unity through the identification with an ideal ego image, begins from a place of bodily fragmentation and to which the ego returns at certain points, such as in dreams and psychosis. Returning to the notion of temporality, we find in Sartre's notions of original and psychic temporality similarities and differences with Lacan's conception of symbolic and imaginary time. Imaginary time, and this is drawn from Seminar 2, entails looking back at what is and seeing in its contingency and objective necessity. So this is exemplified by the I knew it all along phenomenon, or Monday morning quarterbacking, wherein we constantly look at the unpredictable happenings of life as though they were inevitable after they have already happened. Now, symbolic temporality, in contrast, entails a more dynamic conception of time through repetition, for example. In repetition, the past continues to haunt the subject in the present, much like we see how the past operates in Sartre. However, despite some of these remarkable similarities, a key difference arises when we consider the notion of retroaction or après coup. For Sartre, the past is related to dynamically, while at the same time, in being reduced to a mere in itself, is a pure facticity and unalterable by what follows it. The relationship between past and present seems to be more unidirectional, wherein the past haunts the present. We don't see the retroactive effects of the present onto the past. Retroaction in psychoanalysis suggests that the present affects the past as well, reworking it after the fact. And though I could be mistaken on this front, it would seem that Sartre, in trying to stay as far away from a psychological approach, is in a sense required to view the past in this sort of limited objective sense. But we can ask, I think, whether that is not an abstract view of the past rather than an existential and phenomenological one, a dead past rather than a truly living one. Sartre even goes so far as to say in this section that the past is a fatality in reverse. But we might also want to add that as dead, it continues to haunt the present, which Sartre seems to advocate, that the past is not set in stone either. And this is one of the key contributions of psychoanalysis, that the past is dynamically open in a way that Sartre would attribute to the future. And it would be difficult to appreciate that if you're relating to the past as merely a set of unalterable facts, which psychoanalysis doesn't deny that those facts change in any way, but that's not what's important about the past. And to my understanding, existentialism and phenomenology are about getting at a more robust view of concepts that are typically treated in truncated, reified ways. So we'll see if that thinking holds up as we continue on. I want to thank you for watching this video. And if you've learned something from it and you want to contribute to growing this channel, you can start by liking and sharing this video. If you haven't already, you can subscribe. If you like to contribute financially, there's a couple ways you can do that. One is through the super thanks button below. And if you want to be an ongoing supporter, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, and prioritize questions and comments here on YouTube. The link is below. I'd like to thank the following for already supporting this work on Patreon. My present for itself wants to say thank you to your future for itself for watching this video to the end, a future that will be your past once you already watched this. But you can still look forward to a new future possibility of your for itself by watching the next video, which will be on transcendence. So until then, be